We appreciate the presence of everyone. We have visitors with us, and we're glad that you've come and hope you can come back and be with us again. Last Lord's Day morning, we began a study of the 7 churches of Asia, the letters to the 7 churches of Asia, as recorded in chapters 2 and 3 of the great book of Revelation. And so what we have in those letters is there were some of those churches that were good, like Smyrna and Philadelphia. No condemnation given to those churches. There were some churches that had some good and some bad. There was commendation as well as condemnation. Such churches as Ephesus, Pergamos, Thyatira, and Sardis. And there was one church that had no commendation, only condemnation, the church at Laodicea. And so if we were traveling through Asia Minor and looking for a church to identify with, we find this kind of circumstance. We visit one and it seems to be a good church. See, nothing wrong with it at all. See, go to another one and we find nothing really good to say about this church. We go to another one and then another one and even another one, and we find good and bad in those churches. And even another one like that. Then we go to a church and it's good. And we find nothing wrong with that at all. And we made this point last time that most of us would like to be in that church where it's good and there is nothing to be criticized about that church. None of us want to be in a church that's bad and we can find nothing commendable to say about that church. But in reality, we often are in churches where there is some commendation to be made, but there's also some criticism to be made of that church. Now we see that in the church at Ephesus. As we noted last time, we talked in our first one, verses 1 to 7 of chapter 2, was a letter to the church at Ephesus, the church that left its first love. It was a letter that said, your fire is gone. Your enthusiasm has vanished. And you need to repent and return. The next letter begins at verse 8 and only consists of 4 verses. And it was a letter to the church at Smyrna. And here's a church that got a letter that says, your circumstances are bad and it's going to get worse. I don't know how you'd feel about a letter like that. But perhaps you're in a bad circumstance, and what if you got an inspired letter that you know came directly from Jesus himself, and you know it's true, and it says your circumstances are bad, and it's going to get worse. And so we call this church a church under pressure. That's the church at Smyrna, the church under pressure. Now, it's one of the 2 churches that are labeled as good where there is no condemnation given. And so we visit this church as if we were traveling through Asia Minor and we find good things. That's a church under pressure. There's some problems, all right, from the vantage point it's suffering, but there is no condemnation given. This is the shortest of the 7 letters. Only 4 verses in this context. This was a church that was poor by the world standards. They had no physical, material wealth at all, but they were rich in faith and in strength. And thus there is no condemnation. Now, how did the church begin? We don't know for sure. But there is a reference while Paul was at Ephesus in Acts chapter 19 that the gospel spread throughout all of Asia. And perhaps it was on that occasion or from one of those occasions where the gospel was spreading out from Ephesus to all of Asia that the gospel came to Smyrna and the church was planted there. Well, what do we know about Smyrna? Well, that's interesting because that may give us some insight to some things mentioned in these 4 verses. Smyrna is right here, just north, about 40 miles north of Ephesus. And what do we know about Smyrna? It was the birthplace of the Greek poet Homer. It was known for its idolatry, its paganism. They erected a shrine to Roma, a Roman goddess, there in 195 BC. It was chosen for a site of a temple to Tiberius under his reign, which was from 14 AD to 37 AD. But it's important to note that emperor worship was compulsory throughout much of Asia and under the reign of Domitian, and even Nero earlier than that. And that has something to do, I think, with what we're going to see in these 4 verses. So let's read these 4 verses, beginning at verse 8. Here was a letter that was written to a church, and watch for this concept. that he says your circumstances are bad and it's going to get worse. Here's what he says. To the angel of the church at Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last who was dead and came to life. I know your works, tribulation and poverty, but you are rich. And I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Do not fear any of those things which you're about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you in prison that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. And that was the letter. That's quite brief, isn't it? If you could imagine sitting in the service as some messenger comes and says, we have a letter that is to be read before the church. And this is the letter. This consists of the message of the letter. You might be disappointed because you think, I thought there would be more. There is a great deal in this letter. So let's see what this says. Here's a church that's under pressure. Let's start first of all with their challenges. Here's a church that's facing some challenges. And what were their challenges? We visit this church and we spend a little time with them and we realize they're facing some serious challenges. Not that they're involved in sin, not that they're involved in evil, but there's some serious challenges. What are they? Well, first of all, notice at verse 9, I know your works in tribulation. They're facing tribulation. What does that refer to? That's persecution. But it gives the idea of pressure that comes with persecution. Now, suppose all forms of persecution applies some degree of pressure, but there's greater pressure at times than at others. And this implies that there is a great deal of pressure on this church. In fact, the word that is translated here, tribulation, alludes to it at least refers to this concept of grapes in the winepress that are crushed and trampled under feet. Isaiah, in Isaiah 63 and in verse 3, talks about this, of how God's loving kindness toward his people means he will trample the enemy in the winepress. And it is the idea, as we see in the picture here, captured by the artist, as they are trampling and crushing and pressuring the grapes to produce the wine, that's what happens in tribulation. There is this pressure put on that is designed to crush and to trample out. Maybe it's the enemies, as in the case of Isaiah. And in this case, it's the people of God. Here's a church that's under pressure. They're facing tribulation. They're being pressed. They're being crushed. But the second thing I notice in verse 9 is their poverty. He said, I know your tribulation and poverty. Perhaps it has reference to some economic pressure from influential Jews that are mentioned at verse 9 as well. We'll come back to them a little bit later. And some suggest maybe this has to do with this economic pressure from influential Jews. Some suggest that it probably refers to confiscation of property under the Roman Emperor Domitian. Whatever the case may be, they have no economic climb. They have no economic advantage. They are in poverty. That puts pressure on them. There are things they cannot do. There are things they may not can accomplish. He said, I know that. The writer, the Lord himself is saying, I know of your poverty. I took note of that. But there's another thing that's mentioned in the context, and that is the blasphemy. Verse 9. Look again, I know your tribulation and poverty, and I know the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. The idea of blasphemy is slandering the character and the name of others. Your name is being slandered. Your character is being slandered. Perhaps. Then refers to Jews that escaped persecution through compromise under the hand of Domitian or whoever the emperor may be at the time. And what I want to suggest to you is that compromise of others adds pressure. We're talking about a church that's under pressure, and those who compromise add pressure to those who don't. How so? Well, Caesar worship, emperor worship, was more political than it was religious from the vantage point of Rome, because what they're wanting is allegiance to Rome. And what you could do is you could burn incense to Caesar, saying, Caesar is Lord, and worship whatever you wanted to, or who you wanted, and how you wanted, as long as you're loyal to Rome. But you were to say, Caesar is Lord, and burn incense and worship him. You could worship your God if you want to, but you still had to worship Caesar. Apparently there were some Jews who claimed to believe in the one true God who compromised, and they, in essence, are saying Caesar is Lord to save their life. And then they turn around and try to worship the one true God, and labeled here in this context, that's blasphemy. But since true Christians couldn't do the same thing, they would be labeled as traitors by the compromising Jews, and that adds pressure. And I want to tell you that when people of God of our own day, we may not be under persecution, but when we compromise with Satan and we compromise with sin, that adds pressure on those who are trying to do what's right. How many times have you tried to take a stand that I don't participate in this activity, and someone of the world responds, but I know of people in your church that do, and that adds pressure to you. You see, those who compromise add pressure to those who are trying to live right. So here was the challenge they were facing. There are three challenges that I see in this context. A short letter, only 4 verses, but I see they're facing a crushing pressure. They're in poverty, and there's the blasphemy of those who say they are Jews and they are not. They say they're true, but they're not true. They're blasphemers and they're hypocrites, and that just adds more pressure. But that's not all. I want to focus now in this 4-verse short letter on their strength. Here is a church that receives commendation but doesn't receive any condemnation, so it must be a strong church. And so I know their challenges, but what about their strength? Well, the first thing he starts with back at verse 9, I know your works. I know your works. That's part of their strength. They're active, as we saw in the church. At least they had been, the church at Ephesus had been. In other words, their faith is not dead. I know your works. They worked. They didn't merely talk the talk, but they also did the walk. There are many who want to talk a good game. They talk about their love for God. They talk about their service to the Lord, what we ought to do, but then in activity they don't do what they're supposed to do. Not this church. I know your works. Now, works in these letters can either be good or they can be bad. Apparently, these are good because there is no condemnation given in this letter, even though it's just 4 short verses, not a hint at condemnation at all. And so what do we know about their strength? Well, they're an active church. You look around and you see in this church, they're active. Their faith is strong. Apparently, they're doing good works. But that's not all. He said, you're rich. I thought they were in poverty. They are. Look again at verse 9. He said, I know your works, tribulation, and poverty, but you are rich. You're in poverty in one area, but you're rich in another. They're rich in what really mattered. They're rich in their faith, and they're rich in their character. They're rich in their service. And so you look around and you say, yes, this church is under pressure and it's facing challenges. Yes, crushing pressure is coming upon them. And yes, they don't have a dime to their name. And yes, they are being pressured by those who are compromisers. But I want to tell you what I see in this church. I see a church that has faith, it has works, and they are rich in character and rich in faith. They're rich in what really matters, what really counts, when all is said and done. Now I want to focus on their encouragement. You would think a letter that says to them, things are bad and they're going to get worse, would have a note of encouragement somewhere. And it does. What is the note of encouragement? There's some things here that encourage them. The first thing that's mentioned is found in our very opening verse, verse 8, and that is the resurrection of the Lord. He starts on that note. So let's go back to verse 8. And to the angel of the church at Smyrna write, these things says, the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. In other words, you remember this. The one who's telling you things are bad and about to get worse is the very one that died and rose again. There is a resurrection from the dead. That gives you hope. Haley, in his comment on this verse, said, the Lord's victory over death and his present position should inspire confidence within a church that was about to suffer imprisonment and tribulation even unto death. That ought to inspire them. For he who became dead is now alive and able to give victory over every obstacle, even death. So whatever obstacle you may face, whatever challenges that you may be dealing with, whatever problems that you're trying to overcome, remember the resurrection gives you hope, because the very Lord that rose from the dead can give you victory over whatever challenge you may be facing, including death, if that be the challenge. Here's something else that's encouraging. Look at verse 8. God knows all. Go back to verse 8. And to the angel of the church at Smyrna write, these things says the first and the last. He's the beginning and he's the end. He's the first and he's the last. He's from everlasting to everlasting. That means he knows all. That means he knows the truth about you and what's really in your heart. And he knows the truth about your enemy. Here is a church that's under pressure where the enemy is applying pressure and crushing them like trampling out grapes. I wonder in the midst of that if someone thought, I wonder if God even knows what's going on with us. Remember, this letter comes from the first and the last. He knows everything about you. He takes note of what's going on with you, and he knows who's doing that to you. That's an encouragement. You may feel like at times the enemy is against you, Satan is against you, and Satan is working through friends or family or whoever, and they're putting pressure on you, and you wonder, I wonder if anybody takes note that I'm trying to do what's right. Yeah, God knows. He knows everything about you. He knows you're trying to do what's right, and he also knows who's trying to work against you. He knows their every motive. He knows everything there is. But that's not all that's encouraging. There's the resurrection, there's the fact that God knows all, and there's the fact you can overcome. Let's go to verse 11, the end of this short letter. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. You can't overcome. Oh, yes, the pressure is on, and you feel like you're at the bottom of that heap of grapes that's being pressed and crushed. I don't know if we can escape. I don't know if we can overcome. I don't know if we can deal with this. Yeah, you can overcome. You may even face death, but you can overcome in the sense that you don't bow to the pressure. Michael Wilcox said concerning this message, he said, the beauty of the city which rivaled Ephesus was the beauty of a resurrection. 700 years before, old Smyrna had been destroyed and had lain in ruins for 3 centuries. The city of John's time was one that had risen from the dead, and resurrection was to be the experience of its church also. That's interesting, isn't it? The very concept of being resurrected from the dead was a concept Smyrna would be interested in and would be well aware of. Not only maybe a message concerning the Lord, but here was a city that was gone and destroyed and it came back. The same thing can happen with this church. You're being crushed. You can overcome. So here's a word of encouragement. 3 things he said encouraging to them. You remember the resurrection, that gives you hope. And you remember God knows all. And you remember you can overcome. But finally, let's talk about their test. And this is found at verse 10. And we'll spend the rest of our time talking about their test. They face a challenge. It's a tough challenge. And they have marks of strength. And there's words of encouragement given. But you're about to be tested. So he says at verse 10, do not fear any of those things which you're about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you in prison, that you may be, here's our word, tested. And you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of life. Let's start with this. Let's start with the source of their test. The source of their test is not God. God's not putting you through this. God uses this as a test. But don't blame God for this. It may be Rome that's involved. It may be the Domitian, the emperor, that's behind this. But ultimately behind all of that is Satan himself. You remember where the real source is. Look again at verse 10. Do not fear any of those things which you're about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you in prison. No, it's not literally the devil in person coming. It may be the Roman emperor and his cohorts and his underlings that come. But ultimately, that's the devil doing it himself. Where's all this evil coming from? It's coming from Satan himself. But secondly, let's talk about the treatment they're about to receive. What treatment is this church going to face and its members going to face that is said to be a test? Well, first of all, he mentions you're about to suffer. Do not fear any of those things that you're about to suffer. Whatever you go through, it's going to be a suffering. It's not going to be pleasant. It's not going to be a piece of cake. You're already under pressure. Remember I said a moment ago that you're under pressure, things are bad, and it's going to get worse. They're already under tribulation. They're already being crushed, but you're about to suffer. This suffering is in addition to this pressure. And he said some of you will be cast into prison. I don't know that means literal. It may have included that. Perhaps it means the idea of exile. Some of you are going to be taken into exile, as was John. Perhaps it included trials they're going through, being arrested, maybe being fined because they did not bow to the emperor. It might even include death as it does at the end of the verse in verse 10. And he also mentions tribulation. And you shall have tribulation, he said. So I'm not sure when we take each one of these terms with suffering and prison and tribulation, that all this describes is suffering that's about to come. I'm not sure that you take one particular activity and say, this is involved in suffering, but it's not tribulation and it doesn't involve the matter of the prison, or the prison is involving this and it doesn't involve the suffering. It just describes simply the turmoil and the suffering and the pressure of persecution. You're going to receive that. But I'm more interested in the duration of that. An interesting phrase is used. You will have tribulation, he said, 10 days. And in the book of Revelation, I do not take that to be a literal 10 days, 9 plus 1 or 11 minus 1. He's not saying in less than 2 weeks this is going to be over. It's going to last longer than a week, but not 2 weeks. That's not what he's saying. The idea of 10 may give the idea of full and complete and extensive. But at the same time, it's going to come to an end. You're going to face tribulation. You're going to be cast into prison, and you'll face tribulation 10 days. What message does the church get? You're going to be persecuted. Yes, things are bad, and yes, it's going to get worse, but this tribulation is going to come to an end. There's an end to it. Even if it's with your death, it's coming to an end. You're not going to face this forever and forever and forever. Now, let's talk about the reaction. I know the source, I know the treatment, I know the duration. Trying to learn about their test. And look at the end of verse 10. Perhaps this is the most quoted portion of this letter. It's a short letter, but the most quoted portion, be thou faithful unto death. Probably every person could quote that. If this were a Bible class and I said Revelation 2:10 says what, and somebody would say, or several would say, be faithful unto death, we may know what it says, but where does it fit in its context? What's he saying? What he's saying, in spite of the pressure, in spite of the persecution, in spite of things being bad, and in spite of them getting worse, you be faithful anyway, even when you're under pressure. Whatever you're going through is no excuse for not being faithful unto the Lord. Here is a church where already is facing pressure and it's about to get worse. And he said, you be faithful unto death. His point is, even to the point of death. His point is not saying, you be faithful to the day you die. He's saying, you be faithful even to the point of dying. The New Century translates it, even if you have to die. When this pressure gets on and this pressure is coming and they crush you and they trample you, even if they kill you, just go ahead and be faithful in spite of all of those threats. I don't want to tell you that's not easy. One of the well-known members of this church at some point was a man named Polycarp. You have read and heard of Polycarp. Polycarp lived from 70 A.D. to 155 A.D. He would have fit right in the period when this letter was written to the church at Smyrna. Who was Polycarp? Well, he was a direct pupil of the Apostle John. He was a disciple of John who wrote the letter. He was one of those so-called church fathers. He was martyred on Saturday, February the 23rd, 155 A.D. Some have suggested he very well may have been present when this letter would have been read to this church. Now you picture that. You're sitting here and you are a disciple of John yourself. Your name is Polycarp, and you are hearing the letter that says your things are bad and it's about to get worse, and when it does, you be faithful even if it causes you to die. Well, Polycarp, like many others, was charged to worship Caesar and renounce Christ. If you want to live, what you're going to have to do is renounce the Christ that you've been advocating and you've been teaching others, and you say, Caesar is Lord. Why don't you do that? And here's what he said. He said, 86 years I've served Christ, and he's never done me any wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? He's not bowing to the pressure. So they threaten him with fire. We'll burn you at the stake if you don't say, Caesar is Lord. The pressure is about to get worse. And he said, Thou threatenest me with fire which burns for an hour and so is extinguished. But knowest not the fire of a future judgment and of eternal punishment which is reserved for the ungodly. But why tarriest thou? Bring forth what thou wilt. In other words, I'm not bowing to the pressure. Did he overcome? The letter said he could. Yeah, he did. But he was burned at the stake. You see, overcoming doesn't mean you're not going to face condemnation. Doesn't mean you won't face death. He did overcome. He didn't bow to the pressure. He was burned alive at the stake. That's what it means to be faithful unto death, even to the point of dying. And I want to suggest to you, that is a far cry from what we see perhaps in our own lives at times. You think of a man over here was faithful unto death, means he was burned at the stake, and you compare that with half-hearted service to the Lord. Someone who gives a little bit to the Lord, but then they back off, and they give a little more to the Lord, and then they back off, and they're just kind of half-hearted in the service of the Lord. They would get no awards for their faithfulness. They would get no awards for their diligence. They wouldn't be commended at all, for I know your works and your labor of love. They're not commended for that at all. Just half-hearted service. Think of those who miss about half of the services by choice. Compare that to a man who said, I'm not bowing to the pressure at all. How does that compare? Of being faithful even to the point of dying. Think of the casual service we sometimes offer. The carefree spirit. Or how we don't have time to pray, we don't have time to study, we don't have time to go to church. Think of the lack of spirituality we sometimes exemplify. That we're more interested in the here and the now than we are in spiritual matters. Compare that to a man who was burned at the stake because he would not bow to the pressure. He would not say Caesar is Lord. But let's move on. Let's talk about the result. You're going to be tested, he said. The source is the devil. I know the treatment you're going to face, the duration. The reaction when you face all of that is be faithful even to the point of dying. What's the result? You're going to receive a crown of life. Go back to verse 10 with me. Verse 10 says, Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. I'll give you the crown of life. That's victory. You're going to receive victory. In other words, it's a statement of going to heaven. the victory in heaven. But that's not all. Look at verse 11. He that has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt in the second death. Well, that's interesting. It gives me some insight what overcoming involves. Overcoming doesn't mean you're going to escape the first death. Overcoming means you're not going to be hurt in the second death. What is that? That's why I said, and I'll come back to what that is in a moment. That's why I said Polycarp was victorious. He overcame. You say, but they killed him. Sure. There was not a promise he wouldn't be hurt in the first death. It was a promise that he wouldn't be hurt in the second death. Read again verse 10 and 11 together. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you a crown of life. And he that has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says. The one who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. What is the second death? Those who are wicked and ungodly and unfaithful are going to die. That's the first death. But then they face still another death, which is hell. That's the second death. Those who live godly and righteous and faithful, they face a first death, but they face eternal life in heaven. That's why I said Polycarp overcame. It wasn't a promise you're going to escape the first death. He just escaped the second death. So let's go back to verse 11. What's the result of this? What's the result we're talking about? The result is you're not going to be hurt by the second death. That doesn't mean if you remain faithful and you're diligent that you may not die. You may die physically. They may kill you. But the Lord promised, I thought, that if we're faithful, we'll overcome. You will. I'm not saying you won't die. The promise was given to Polycarp. You're going to overcome. He did. He didn't face the second death. He faced the first one all right, but he didn't face the second death. So what is their test? They're going to get worse. Things are going to get worse. That's your test. Things are bad now, but it's about to get a lot worse. The source is the devil. You're going to face tribulation. You're going to be in tribulation for 10 days. You're going to be cast into prison. You be faithful anyway, and the result is you're going to have the crown of life, and you will not be hurt in the second death. Here's a church that is under pressure. Again, things are bad. They're about to get worse. Maybe you're facing some pressure. There is no promise of the Lord that, you know what, things are going to get better soon. It may get worse. They may get worse. You say, could I die because of my... Yeah, that could happen to you. Sure could. There's no promise of the Lord that you won't face death because of your allegiance to the Lord. But be thou faithful unto death, and I'll give thee a crown of life. Here's a church under pressure. Their challenge is their strength, their encouragement, and their test. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and sing?